Do you know what a hazard is? Is it the same as a risk? Well, a hazard is anything that can cause harm. For example, chemicals in the workplace, electrical equipment, vehicles, confined spaces, working at height or with machinery. All these things could potentially be a hazard to us. The risk is the likelihood of that hazard causing harm to you or anyone else in the workplace or beyond. A risk assessment, therefore, is the method we use to identify hazards and the risks we're exposed to within our workplace. The risk assessment has to cover all methods of working, including product, processes, equipment and machinery. In short, virtually everything that goes on within any working environment. The objective of the risk assessment is to remove or reduce the potential to cause harm. What you have to bear in mind is that after making a risk assessment, the hazard may still be there, but you'll have reduced the risk. The Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 states that all employers have a duty to provide and maintain a safe workplace. The Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999 state, every employer shall make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to the health and safety of his employees to which they are exposed whilst they're at work. This also applies to subcontractors and visitors. Whoever you are, whatever you do, a risk assessment of your work activities has to be carried out. This doesn't mean every single day, it doesn't mean forever filling in forms. What it does mean is that once you've made a risk assessment and put into practice all the recommendations, then you will be working more safely, and that's a fact. What we're going to do is help you understand and be part of the risk assessment process. To do this, we've identified 5 key stages to assessing hazards and risks, and we're going to unlock that information for you. Now, these 5 key stages are identifying the hazard, the risk, the level of risk, who is at risk, and risk control. You know your own workplace better than anybody else, and you know that it can change from day to day. Identifying the hazards in your workplace should be partly down to plain old common sense. In fact, your senses, your eyes, your ears, and even your nose, will help you identify where potential hazards exist. However, a competent person who has knowledge of the health and safety requirements in your workplace should carry out all risk assessments. Ideally, both you and the competent person would collaborate in the risk assessment process. Whether you're the appointed competent person or the operative, identifying hazards may bring out a little bit of the detective in you. Data sheets and records of particular operations and processes could indicate potential hazards. Accident and illness records are good indications of where hazards may exist. Talking to people can also provide valuable information, but that doesn't just mean the health and safety advisor talking to staff. Everybody has a part to play. If you're an employee, you have a duty to report hazards. It's your responsibility. Your knowledge and experience counts for a lot and will be useful when assessing changes or new practices in your area. Your vigilance and communication is vital in identifying hazards in the workplace. Don't take anything for granted. You don't have to overcomplicate things, and don't expect other people to do the risk assessment for you. Let's take a look at the potential risks and hazards in this room. Did you identify the hazards in this room? Well, let's go back and take a look at what they were. Firstly, the chemical drum is a fire hazard. Next, the machine is unguarded. The cable is trailing and could possibly cause someone to trip. The grinder is a noise and fire hazard. The air vent is broken and is an environmental and respiratory hazard. The box is a falling and manual handling hazard. The fire extinguisher is potentially an electrical or explosive hazard. Therefore, if something is likely to cause harm, you must take action. You need to look at the severity of the situation. Ask yourself, what would the likely effect be? Is anyone in immediate danger? you may have to shut down or move an operation. On the other hand, a simple solution might be found to prevent loss or injury. We've seen a room full of hazards, but what are the risks? The chemical drum is a fire hazard and the risk is to loss of property, injury or even death. The risk from the unguarded machine is entanglement, serious injury or worse. The trailing cable is a hazard and the risk of injury and loss of property comes from tripping. The grinder, although not being used, presents a risk of damage to hearing, a fire risk and poses a physical injury risk if it fell off the bench. The broken air vent is a risk to anyone who works in the room and is exposed to fumes, such as somebody opening the chemical drum or somebody using the grinder. The heavy box is a risk to anybody moving the load and the risk of crushing if it fell or was dropped. The fire extinguisher is a risk to life and property. Now that you've discovered the difference between the hazard and the risk, you need to highlight the likelihood and the consequences of the hazard causing harm or loss. The risk could affect your output, productivity, property and ultimately your business, but even more importantly, it can cause injury or death. Now that you've identified the risks, you need to determine what the level of risk is. Ask yourself these questions. How often is it likely to happen? What would be the extent of injury? What would be the consequence of loss? How long and how much is the exposure to the risk? A simple way of categorising risk is to use a scale of high, medium or low. For example, if something is likely to happen imminently or frequently, causing harm or damage, the risk must be high. If something is only likely to cause minor harm infrequently, then the risk is potentially low. Defining risk levels calls upon your experience and knowledge of the work and workplace. The ideal method of setting risk levels is the team approach. Your expertise, matched with the knowledge of the competent health and safety advisor, will take into account experience and compliance to the law. Now let's determine the levels of our risks. What do you think? The chemical drum is a high risk. The unguarded machine also a high risk. The trailing cable must be a high risk. The grinder on the bench without a trailing cable would be a medium risk, but in this situation, again, a high risk. The broken air vent, has it been isolated? Well, we don't know, so it's a high risk. The heavy box at the moment is a medium risk. It's stationary. If somebody attempts to move it manually, the risk must increase. The fire extinguisher is definitely a high risk. It's a water extinguisher, and if used on an electrical or chemical fire, there could be shocking and explosive results. It's a requirement in all risk assessments that you identify the people who might be put at risk. Your risk assessment must involve the hazard and the level of risk those people could be exposed to. For example, a young trainee or a visitor like me will be at greater risk than someone who has knowledge of the hazardous tasks, processes and areas within the workplace. Generally, those at risk are employees, the self-employed and contractors, clients and customers, visitors, cleaners, patients and residents, students and trainees, the general public, and any other person sharing your workplace. So who's at risk in our room? Well, the operative for a start. In fact, anybody who walks into the room may be a visitor or a cleaner, or even a health and safety inspector. They're all exposed to risk of injury through tripping, entanglement, poor ventilation, and fire or explosion. Other employees may be affected through contaminated air, or in the event of fire, loss of livelihood and injury. The employer is also at risk, as the poor health and safety measures in this room indicate that if anything were to go wrong, they could be facing substantial financial loss through fire. This may lead to closure, prosecution, and even a prison sentence. The main aim of a risk assessment is to put into place suitable and sufficient control measures to reduce or remove the risk. You don't have to overcomplicate things, but at the same time, you shouldn't trivialise something that may not seem that important. Whatever control you put in place to reduce a risk, where possible, it shouldn't hamper the operation. Controlling risks is a process of balancing the level of risk against the safety of those at risk. The controls can be far-reaching and comprehensive, such as installing extensive fire prevention systems or changing a complete production process. There could equally be a simple solution, such as a toolbox training session, moving something to a safe area, or placing warning signs in key areas. An important part of controlling a risk assessment is paperwork. You must record all your findings and keep them on file. It's vital that your risk assessment is updated when processes, practices or personnel change. It's also recommended that your risk assessment is reviewed on a regular basis. A risk assessment form should ideally provide you with all the details that you need to note during the taking of an assessment. They should be simple, straightforward and clear. The recommendations or controls should be acted upon and also recorded and kept on file. Risk assessment is not a one-off activity. It should be an ongoing process, ensuring increased safety in the workplace. Now that we've completed a risk assessment on our room, we can now put into place our control measures. What do you think these would be? The chemical drum. Well, first of all, do we need it on site in the first place? Can we dispose of it in a safe and correct manner? Or, we still need it, so we take it to a safe chemical store. It was a high risk. It's now been reduced to a medium risk. The unguarded machine. The risk assessment suggests that we put a suitable guard on the machine, reducing the risk to the operative from high to low. The cable, in a working situation, should either be safely rerouted or covered with a cable bridge. Signs should also be put in place warning of the hazard. Or, when nobody is working, the cable should be removed and stored safely. This reduces the risk from high to low. The grinder is removed and stored safely. This has reduced the risk from medium to low. The air vent is repaired and tested to establish the airflow is sufficient for the area of extraction and the type of fumes vented. This reduces the risk from high to medium. The 30-kilogram box is moved to a lower level and it's then split into two 15-kilogram boxes. This has reduced the risk of injury from medium to low. The fire extinguisher is replaced with the correct fire extinguisher for that area. This is a carbon dioxide extinguisher and is suitable for chemical and electrical fires, so the risk has been reduced from high to low. We hope this has helped you think about risk assessment in a new and positive way. Remember the 5 key stages. Identify the hazard, the risk, the level of risk, who's at risk, and risk control. Making a risk assessment is for the benefit of all of us. Most risk assessments rely on common sense, but don't just accept the obvious. Be sure in your own mind that you're making the right decision. If you're not sure, seek help and guidance. Be part of a team. There are hundreds of thousands of situations in this country alone where risk assessment should be made. What is shared by all of them is that they must all follow the 5 key stages, and the investigation, recommendations and controls must be recorded and acted upon. So don't take risks, stay safe.